With you. Have a good New Year.
Now discussion on religion and politics through American history. The Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis and Southern Methodist University Center for Presidential History hosted this event. It's an hour, 10 minutes.
There's always been a strain of conservative thought and life in American Christianity, holding to similar beliefs about marriage, family, abortion, and other conservative issues as their white evangelical and fundamentalist counterparts. Yet they have one big difference. They are locked into a history of slavery and the fight for civil rights in America. What is different that many of these African American conservatives have voted primarily Democratic when they could vote in the last 40 to 50 years, giving the illusion that they signed on to all of the liberal policies of the Democrats in the post-civil rights era. While they have voted against Democrats, issues like same-sex marriage have driven their exodus from the party. Consider in the 2004 election where George Bush received 11% of the African-American vote, in part because of same-sex marriage initiatives on the ballot. Now, that was a kind of an interesting anomaly, and I could go into that, but that's another story altogether, so just keep that in mind. But then there leaves a question. How do Black conservatives align their religious beliefs alongside their racial beliefs? How do these believers rationalize holding their nose to vote for Obama in some cases while chastising him about the policies they believe hurt Black families? What issues prompt other Black conservatives to make alliances with white evangelicals against the nation's first Black president? To understand this dissonance and division, I would like to briefly look at a history of African American involvement in same-sex marriage and abortion issues during the age of Obama. Black conservatives have fiscal and economic concerns, but their religious concerns are rooted in historical issues, and they fuel a new resurgence in Black conservatism in order to fight what they believe to be the future of Black families. A little bit of history. In a recent book on Black conservatism entitled Black Conservative Intellectuals in Modern America, Michael Onjate states at the outset that when one considers the extent to which American conservatism has been conditioned by racist notions of Black inferiority, the existence of powerful conservative Black spokespeople is astounding. Onjate's book attempts to understand how Black conservatives arise in spite of the inherent racial bias in American conservatism. My contention is that you cannot understand these Black conservatives without understanding how notions of religiosity and respectability are valued as a counter-narrative to the denigration of African Americans racially and in white conservatism. Taking respectability seriously, as well as conservative biblical beliefs, gives a different genealogy for Black conservatives that does not begin in the 1970s with Shelby Steele, but in the 19th century. According to Charles P. Henry, Emeritus Professor of African American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, a more organic conservatism, which starts in the 19th century, focuses on uplift and morality, rejecting both racial identification and racial institutions. Embracing a white standard for Black moral worth was the key to success, assimilation, and respect. While Henry's analysis of the genealogy of Black conservatism is sound, I believe that also the shift from a prophetic focus within Black Christian churches to an embrace of prosperity and a resurgence of respectability in the post-civil rights era is part of the issue. In a piece that I wrote for Dissent magazine entitled The Black Church from Prophecy to Prosperity, I argued that respectability politics in the post-civil rights era are lodged in emphasis of Black churches switching from prophetic action to prosperity. Additionally, these churches shifting focus from structural sins of racism to individual sins of becoming respectable and prosperous led to a diminishing of their prophetic voice in the public realm. It is this dissonance that has made the manner in which Black conservatives engage President Obama, push them both to the forefront and put them in a quandary. How to put forth the issues that they care about, in this case abortion and same-sex marriage, as either issues that everyone should care about or issues affecting the African American community. What does the election of the nation's first Black president do to conservative Black alliances? Do they remain in the African American community to fight for their ideal of the Black family, or do they partner with white evangelicals and other conservatives? I believe that for Black conservatives, alliances with white conservatives that remain true to specific issues allows them to fight for Black families while at the same time balkanizing them from both communities, both white conservatives and African Americans alike. African American conservatives and abortion. Both conservatives and nationalists in the African American community historically have used the term genocide to describe abortion and other population control methods. This mythos of the reduction in black population through abortion arises from a misappropriation of a quote by Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood in 1939. The Negro Project, which was started by her in that same year, was designed to bring health care to black women in the South. According to Sanger, both a Negro physician and a Negro religious minister should work together in order for the project to succeed and gain the trust of the black community. Sanger wanted a minister to debunk claims, if they arose, that the program was designed to exterminate the community. Abortion activists later would simply turn this phrase and say that Sanger wanted to exterminate the black community, not save it, and would do that through abortion, which is why people come against Planned Parenthood a lot. Slavery is the other appeal that pro-life activists use in tandem with the Sanger slander to promote the idea that black people are being considered less than human by abortion rights activists. Using the Dred Scott decision as a foil, pro-life activists, including African Americans, claim that much like the Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court that declared African Americans 3/5 of a person, Roe versus Wade does the same. So during the presidential campaign of 2008, the rise of this word genocide began to increase. Rod Parsley, a white Ohio megachurch pastor with a large African-American congregation and television following, began to preach a series on how abortion was black genocide. In February of 2008, he would also go along to be a supporter of John McCain, and then McCain had to get rid of him 2 months later in his own pastor problem. Other black conservative pro-life people would pick up the tempo, using the term black genocide to describe abortion and linking Obama to it. Black pro-life conservatives such as Alveda King and Dave Gardner would continue to do this throughout the 2008 campaign and put their, how would I say this? They would put their dissent in front of major democratic events. So for instance, when the convention was held in Denver in 2008, they protested on the outside along with a whole lot of other pro-life democratic activists. But this signaled a sort of a new tactic. So when we think about what happened right after the inauguration with Alveda King, there became an uptick in how people went after pro-life issues and complaining about Obama. And so one of the things that happened during this time was the new movie that came out in June of 2009. And this movie was called Maafa 21, The Story of Black Genocide. Produced and funded by white abortion activist Mark Crutcher, founder of Life Dynamics, Maafa 21 depicted how abortion had targeted black communities through eugenics and Planned Parenthood. The word Maafa in Swahili means tragedy or disaster, and used a real conspiracy thesis for the origins of the abortion movement, eugenics and Planned Parenthood. Copies of the DVD of Maafa 21 were available to churches and individuals for a nominal fee, and there was also a compelling trailer on YouTube. Well-produced, the slick movie was shown at historically black colleges and universities such as Morris Brown College in Atlanta, and black conservative right-to-life leaders picked it up for use. In Atlanta, Catherine Davis, minority outreach coordinator for Georgia Right to Life, began traveling to colleges and churches to show the movie. Coupling it with over 80 billboards around Atlanta that proclaimed black children are an endangered species, people were directed to a site, toomanyAborted.com, and Nancy Smith, director of the Georgia Right to Life, would tell the New York Times that she was surprised that they were spending less money and had more calls to the hotline, and that was a result because of this movie being shown in the Atlanta and Georgia area. Similar billboards would appear across the country in 2011, including Chicago and Soho in New York, sponsored by Pastor Stephen Broden, African-American pastor of Fair Park Bible Fellowship right here in Dallas, and a founder of Life Always. On the south side of Chicago, the anti-abortion billboards that Broden promoted had a picture of President Obama with the caption, "Every 21 minutes, our next possible leader is aborted." Broden, a rather colorful figure who ran for Congress as a Republican in 2010 but lost, is touted on the National Black Pro-Life Coalition website with the following quote, "The practice of abortion is a genocidal plot to decimate the demography of our community, and black leaders are silent. Their silence is egregious and tantamount to approval." Speakers like Day, King, Broden, and other black pro-lifers are not as well known to the broader black population, yet they are well known in white evangelical conservative circles and often are extended invitations to speak at major conservative events such as the Values Voter Summit. They have achieved that respectability that their 19th and early 20th century fellow black conservatives desired. What they have not gained are other black conservatives who vote Democratic to switch their voting patterns simply out of a desire to see Roe versus Wade repealed. And now I want to shift to talking about black conservatives and same-sex marriage. While black conservatives in the pro-life movement worked hard to make African Americans pay attention to their cause, conservative supporters of marriage between a man and a woman had much more support in the African American community. A Pew Center research poll in 2013 showed that there was a scant 2% difference in the percentage of black Protestants from 2003, 66%, to 2013, 64%, that changed their minds about same-sex marriage on the grounds of religious belief. In other words, it was only a 2% difference, almost negligible in the amount of people who did not believe in same-sex marriage. While that percentage has changed within the last year, and I believe that's in part because of Obama's announcement, one can safely say that African Americans are very conservative on the issue of same-sex marriage, and despite the tendency to vote for other liberal causes, their stance on same-sex marriage is holding firm. Part of this has to do with religious belief, but it also has to do with the opposition to equating same-sex marriage with civil rights. Leaders such as the recently departed Fred Shuttlesworth made it clear in the past that same-sex marriage was not a cause to be equated with the black civil rights movement. In an interview with Ebony magazine, he said this: "Despite what many in this world may argue, I cannot waver from the God-established principle that marriage is a union meant to be shared between a man and a woman, and no matter how the open-minded people of this earth become, God's word cannot be changed and should not be ignored. God created men to be husbands of wives and women to be wives of husbands." Opposition by many African Americans with same-sex marriage presents a conundrum in defining what a conservative is in their context. On the one hand, these voters hold to a conservative sense of scripture concerning sexuality and marriage, but are likely more to vote for government intervention, benefits, and Democratic candidates. The question is, should they be considered to be true conservative voters? Before 2008, Obama himself had articulated several positions on same-sex marriage, including yes as far back as 1998, undecided, supportive of the repeal of DOMA, and supporting civil unions. So while Obama had undergone a progression of thinking, his announcement of his support for same-sex marriage actually took black religious conservative leaders by surprise. The NAACP announcing a few days later that they supported the president's statement on same-sex marriage was another blow and put black conservative leaders on the defensive. Two of the most vocal pastors who opposed Obama's announcement were Jamal Bryant of Empowerment Temple in Baltimore and Reverend William Owens, the president of the Coalition of African American Pastors, or CAP. Jamal Bryant, a prosperity preacher who uses catchy sermons and colloquialisms in his congregation, was on every news show in the days following the announcement, expressing his dismay at the president's decision. And this is a little bit of a long quote, but I think it really captures the essence of what was going on with a lot of black pastors. My response was shock and disappointment. And while many clergy are trying to discern it, is this decision made out of political expediency or moral conviction? The timeliness of this whole matter does not make sense given what has happened in North Carolina. So my question is he, Obama, exchanging one minority for another? It has been speculated that the president is taking the black vote for granted. So did he think he could do this without any losses from black supporters? The president has not been able to find one credible black pastor of note to stand with him on this issue. That's saying something. Other noted black conservatives like Bishop Harry Jackson and Bishop Larry Palmer in D.C. a few days after the announcement at the Defense of Marriage Summit in May of 2012 joined with white conservatives to confront the president on the issue of same-sex marriage. In an interview with Christian Broadcasting, Bishop Palmer remarked, "I don't think that same-sex marriage is irrelevant to civil rights fight at all. It's a fight between right and wrong. This happens to be wrong." What was noticeable, however, were the reiterations from denominations, and black denominations in particular, on their stances on same-sex marriage. The Church of God in Christ, the largest African-American Pentecostal denomination, largest Pentecostal denomination in the country, immediately reissued their statement on marriage from 2004 to the press and members of the denomination. Linking the debate about same-sex marriage to the debate on civil rights, their statement spoke of God's design for the family and marriage between a man and a woman. The AME Zion Church would reiterate their statement on marriage between a man and a woman, but also made the distinction of that between the rights of the state and the rights of the church. And I should say here that a lot of black churches back in the 90s were really for civil unions, but were not for same-sex marriage. There's a big difference there. More importantly, the statement noted that positions of the president are consistent with the interests of our congregational members, and issues, not the issue, become the nexus of our consideration. Even Jamal Bryant would eventually accede to the impetus of the election as November 2012 grew closer, registering voters at the Empowerment Temple Church in Baltimore. Bryant held fast to his opposition of same-sex marriage, which was very important in light of the Maryland's ballot initiative on the 2012 election roster to permit same-sex marriage, known as Referendum 6 in Maryland. After a pitched battle there between black pastors and churches for and against the referendum, it passed on election night 2012, along with President Obama for a second term. The flight of African American voters from Obama because of his support of same-sex marriage really did not occur, with Obama receiving more than 90% of the African American vote. So let me draw this to a close. What are we to make of these two issues, abortion and same-sex marriage, with regard to a potential uptick in black conservatives? Despite the visibility of black conservatives during the Obama presidency, the manner in which these conservatives raised their issue with abortion and same-sex marriage varied. Black conservatives working with white organizations were able to amplify their voices in the media on issues. White anti-abortion organizations benefited from black conservative faces and voices to further their cause. The case for same-sex marriage, however, did not fare well, with increasing number of states approving same-sex marriage and African Americans slowly becoming more accepting of same-sex marriage, although at a slower rate than the general population. All of these stories, however, beg an important question. Are black conservatives simply tools of the larger white conservative organizations? Perhaps they are, perhaps not. But it is clear for the leadership on abortion and same-sex marriage issues that charismatic leaders who play the circuit of meetings like Values Voters, Defense of Marriage, and Right to Life marches find like-minded people of all ethnicities. For black conservatives, crossing over to vote Republican or becoming Republican or placing moral issues over economic and other concerns of the community may alienate them from black Christian voters who are conservative in their personal moral beliefs, but are moderate when it comes to issues of economic, education, and other liberal issues. Factoring in Barack Obama as the first black president certainly has made it more difficult for some black conservatives and made a name for others who have decided to oppose the president on moral grounds. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Hedstrom from the University of Virginia, and I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for sticking with us this afternoon. My remarks today stem from a question. What happened to Judeo-Christian America? Asked the religion scholar Diana Butler Bass in a Washington Post essay in January of 2014. The question was not a lament, just a sincere inquiry rooted in a basic but far-reaching observation. Bass's question arose from the simple fact that the religious demographics of the United States, and even more the religious sensibilities of many Americans, have undergone profound shifts in the last 2 decades. Modest increases in religious diversity, and even more significantly, a marked rise in religious disaffiliation, especially among the young, are transforming long-standing realities of American religious life and therefore American politics as well. The best accounting today shows that roughly 20% of the population is now unaffiliated, including 1 out of 3 of those under age 30, while the percentage of Christians has dropped from 95% in 1960 to 75% today. So this is the 75% Christian, 20% unaffiliated, 5% everyone else breakdown that Kevin Schultz talked to us about earlier. And I should just add to this that these two phenomena, the decline in Christianity and the rise in the religiously unaffiliated, are very much two sides of the same demographic coin. Almost the entirety of the religiously unaffiliated are white Protestants and Catholics who have left their churches. The era when a triple entente of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews more or less fully described the arena we call religion and politics, in other words, is over. So what did happen to Judeo-Christian America, and what is taking its place, and what light can history shed on these developments? Judeo-Christianity, it must be said, had a good run. The term itself dates from the late 19th century and acquired its current meanings in the 1930s. Originally coined to describe the common ancient heritage of Jews and Christians, in the 1930s, leaders of the ecumenical and interfaith movements redeployed the term to indicate the joint contributions of Catholics, Jews, and Protestants to American democracy. It was, in this way, a term of social and political inclusion, meant to signal the liberal opposition to discrimination at home and fascism abroad, as Kevin Schultz has written in his wonderful book. The ideological pressures and realignments of the Second World War and the Cold War, soon to follow, in his words, brought almost all Americans into the fold of civic Judeo-Christianity. But no more. A quarter century ago, the sociologist Robert Wuthnow famously wrote of a restructuring of American religion, a shift from denominationalism to broad liberal and conservative coalitions. Increasingly, it seems we are witnessing in the early 21st century yet another restructuring, away from the Judeo-Christian era, during which liberals and conservatives vied for dominance, and toward a new paradigm in which the major fault line now runs between religion and spirituality. And I use that term spirituality here very self-consciously because we should be clear that most of those who have religiously disaffiliated are not becoming atheists. That number is about 3%, and actually holding fairly steady. So there is actually a certain kind of religious content to the religiously disaffiliated that we need to come to terms with. The journalist Peter Beinart, in a recent essay on the end of American exceptionalism, has made a convincing case, I think, that the turn from religion is best understood in political terms. In the mid-20th century, Beinart writes, liberals were almost as likely as conservatives to attend church. But starting in the 1970s, when the religious right began agitating against abortion, feminism, and gay rights, liberals began to identify organized Christianity with conservative politics. The religiously unaffiliated, Beinart continues, are disproportionately liberal, pro-gay marriage, and critical of churches meddling in politics too much. Many young Americans, Beinart concludes, and I love his phrasing here, have begun voting against the GOP on Sunday mornings by declining to attend church. To begin to analyze this phenomenon, historically, I think we must first recognize that the spiritual but not religious of today are inheritors of a theological legacy rooted in the liberal Protestantism of the 18th and 19th centuries. Here I am tempted to trace a line from Thomas Jefferson's surgery on the Bible in 1804 that Charles Irons told us about, through the Transcendentalist revolt against Unitarianism 3 decades later, and on through the history of liberal theology and its popularization in the 20th century. This narrative would track the evolving distinction between what Theodore Parker famously called the transient and the permanent in Christianity. Outer churchly forms come and go, Parker contended, while the essence of religious truth remains, a formulation that allowed then, and I think continues to allow, the rejection of church without a rejection of God. I can hear this exact formulation in my religious studies classes today. Rather than pursue this theological line, however, I want to focus in a more historical vein on some of the historical mechanisms by which this kind of thinking, this sort of distinction between the transient and permanent, acquired its legitimacy. And the way I want to do that for the purposes of this talk today is to talk about the theological and religious quandary presented by religious others. A hallmark of religious liberalism since the days of the Transcendentalists has been its spiritual cosmopolitanism, its religious interest in religious others, a phenomenon nearly ubiquitous today, from Jews doing yoga to Presbyterians reading the Dalai Lama, and much more. Sociologist Christian Smith, in his study of young adults published in 2009, finds that majorities agree with the propositions These are the questions that he's asked that majorities agree with. Many religions are true. It is okay to pick and choose religious beliefs without having to accept the teachings of faith as a whole. And it is okay to practice religions besides one's own. A majority of young adults agree with these phrases. A look back to a period of perhaps the most consequential and challenging encounters of American religious liberalism with religious others reveals the dynamics at play in these emerging cosmopolitan sensibilities. The early decades of the 20th century are where I want to turn. These were a particularly pivotal moment in the development of cosmopolitan liberalism. While intellectuals embraced new anthropological and philosophical understandings of race, stemming from the scholarship of Franz Boas and Horace Callan, leaders in the churches worked to disentangle missionary work from Western cultural and racial imperialism, a project that resulted in the landmark 1932 report, Rethinking Missions. Significantly, colonial subjects themselves pressed these religious and theological shifts as part of their own nationalist ambitions, while religious liberals in the U.S. subsequently adopted and adapted such anti-colonial critiques for their own theological and political purposes. The most compelling example of this, I think, and the example I want to dwell on for the remainder of my talk, is that of Mohandas K. Gandhi and his impact on American spirituality. In short, Gandhi transformed the religious imagination of 20th century liberals through a process that can best be described as canonization. The canonization of Gandhi as a liberal Protestant saint challenged American religious liberals to decouple their Christianity from its hegemonic Western identity, to find once again its permanent essence amid the corruptions of history. Gandhi, more than any other figure in the 20th century, or really more precisely, the idea of Gandhi, the constructed idea of Gandhi as a universal saint, demanded of American religious liberals a radical rethinking of the relationship of Christianity to the Western racial and colonial order. A key figure here is Stanley Jones, Methodist missionary in India and author of the best-selling book, Christ of the Indian Road from 1925. Jones, along with a handful of others, such as John Haynes Holmes, Howard Thurman, and Richard Gregg, served as the most influential interpreter of Gandhi for the North American Protestant audience. As the most famous missionary and one of the most admired men in the United States, Jones's framing of Gandhi carried significant weight and entered a religious and political climate ripe for recalibration. He was an acquaintance and admirer of Gandhi for decades and was in fact scheduled to meet with the Mahatma on the day he was assassinated. Jones penned Mahatma Gandhi, an interpretation in 1948 as a tribute to a fallen hero. In this work, he presented Gandhi as a bridge between East and West, noting, and these are his words, through his methods and spirit, they were in large measure reconciled, perhaps a bit optimistic there. Since the 19th century, as I've said, liberal Protestant spirituality had sought to frame religious experience in human universal terms, a project foundational to the field of comparative religious study as it developed in the Western Academy. Jones presented Gandhi in similar terms. In spite of his constant protests against the Christian faith as represented in the missionary movement in India, Jones wrote, he was more Christianized than most Christians. In this way, according to Jones, Gandhi, quote, draws together people of varying viewpoints and makes them feel they have a common center. The Hindus pay their tribute to a Hindu who is deeply Christianized, and the Christians pay their tribute to a man, Christian in spirit, who was a Hindu. In some ways, the veneration of Gandhi is so thoroughly established in our times that it can be hard to remember how radical this universalizing project was and the degree of intellectual and theological contortionism it required. We must not try to claim him when he himself would probably repudiate the claim, Jones conceded. He was fundamentally a Hindu. The roots of his spiritual life were not in Christ. They were in the Bhagavad Gita. But Jones, who knew Gandhi and loved Gandhi, was unable to let this be the last word, especially writing in the wake of Gandhi's assassination. So Jones deracinated Gandhi, made him into a man of spirit and the eternal rather than a man of time and place and history. He became, in other words, a liberal Protestant saint. The phrases Jones used to bridge this gap are remarkable. The Mahatma was a natural Christian rather than an orthodox one, Jones wrote. The distinction between a natural Christian and an orthodox one reveals the manner in which Gandhi, as defined by Jones, embodied the very essence of liberal Protestantism. He transcended creed and practice, the constraints of outmoded orthodoxy, and reached the higher plane of natural faith, a faith that was pure, spiritual, unbounded, universal. The man who fought Christian civilization, so-called, furthered the real thing, Jones proclaimed. God uses many instruments, and he has used Mahatma Gandhi to help Christianize unchristian Christianity. Conservative mainline and evangelical Protestants excoriated Jones for embracing a Hindu as a religious inspiration. A prominent Baptist preacher, for example, circulated widely a pamphlet describing Jones's admiration of Gandhi. This is what E. Stanley Jones believes was the pamphlet's scandalous title, and it bore the additional tagline, "If you believe the Lord Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world and not Mahatma Gandhi, read this." But Jones was not to be deterred. He prepared his own counter-circular called "Are We Too Proud to Learn from a Hindu?" that favorably cited Gandhi's political critiques of the so-called Christian nations. And based on his experiences in India, Jones regularly spoke in the US about the need for a more equitable economic order, and even more controversially condemned American Jim Crow through comparisons to the Indian caste system. The New York Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes, another of Gandhi's most significant American interlocutors, stated the case even more baldly. He was a bit freer to do that, of course, as a Unitarian, and in some ways I think his Unitarian sensibilities and framing of this issue are the ones that have actually carried the day, but in some ways what E. Stanley Jones had to do as a Methodist, and a Methodist with, in fact, evangelical sensibilities, more clearly reveals the theological tensions of mid-century. So I refer to Holmes here as a figure who is pointing forward in some ways to our own spiritual but not religious. He was a radical politically, a socialist and a pacifist, a leader of the ACLU and the NAACP, and a founder of what he called the All-World Gandhi Fellowship. Holmes made the case for Gandhi that, as I said, I think most clearly resonates with the spiritual flight from organized Christianity that we see today. And I'm going to read an extended quote here from John Haynes Holmes in an unpublished manuscript that I think just beautifully captures these sentiments. This is from 1944. "The basic trouble lies in the fact that the greatest of all Indians, the most influential among his countrymen, and a figure of exalted spiritual stature declines to become converted to the Christian gospel. He certainly is a better Christian in the ethical sense of the word than the overwhelming multitude of those who profess the Christian faith. But all this only makes the more irritating the fact that Gandhi throughout his career has remained loyal to Hinduism, the religion of his fathers and the majority of his people. And why should he adopt an alien faith when his own native faith gives him comfort and inspiration? Christianity is, in essence, a good and true religion. So is Mohammedanism. Gandhi gladly uses the scriptures, prayers, and hymns of these religions to supplement Hinduism, and therewith enrich his soul's experience. But no religion, Christianity, or any other has any monopoly on faith, has any monopoly on truth. Hinduism, as well as Christianity, can save the soul and redeem the world. But this is a flat repudiation of Christianity's claim to be a uniquely inspired faith. It opens up the way to the whole dangerous concept of religion not as an exclusive revelation, but as the universal experience of mankind. The very magnitude and beauty of Gandhi's personality as a Hindu constitutes a serious reflection upon the indispensable nature of the Christian gospel. This is his unpardonable sin, that a non-Christian can outmatch the Christian in virtue. I think it's just a fantastic paragraph as a document. As Emerson and Parker had done in the 19th century, the cult of Gandhi in the 20th century, and even more, of course, the broad movement towards an emerging cosmopolitanism that I'm using it to represent. This laid the groundwork for the religious and political shifts now underway. Leaving organized religion is a viable religious option for young Americans today because they affirm with their liberal religious predecessors that truth is not exclusive to any one tradition of faith and certainly not to be found in religions, creeds, or rituals. Yet, as the examples of 19th century transcendentalism and 20th century cosmopolitanism make clear, the American revolt against Christian exclusivism and indeed against organized Christianity itself is not best described as secularization. We are not witnessing the transformation of the United States into a North American Sweden. Not only will large numbers of Americans remain affiliated with traditional Christianity for the foreseeable future, those who abandon Christianity do not typically abandon religion, broadly understood. If anything, the religious nones, the N-O-N-E-S, the unaffiliated, the religious nuns aim to give religion an even wider berth, to liberate it from its political and exclusivist shackles. The German sociologist Max Weber argued at the dawn of the 20th century that Western modernity was in the thralls of a thoroughgoing disenchantment, a despiritualization of culture and consciousness brought about by science and bureaucratic rationality. Yet the rise of the nuns as a revolt against politicized Christianity signals nothing more clearly than a massive generational shift towards re-enchantment. Political Christianity lost its spark. Where now that spark may be found is the great drama of American religious life in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you all for sticking this out. My name is Matt Sutton from Washington State University. So the end is near, and I'm not just referring to today's proceedings. Substantial numbers of Americans believe that the universe is rapidly moving to its close. They're sure that the world as they know it is coming to its end. Many Americans are waiting for the ice caps to melt, for global pandemics like Ebola to spread. And doomsday preppers are stocking their basements with guns, ammunition, and dehydrated food. There's no doubt that Americans in recent decades have been consumed by apocalyptic nightmares. Now, for some Americans, there's a particularly religious dimension to this as well, to this apocalypse in the making. A recent poll revealed that 41% of all Americans, that's well over 100 million people, and 58% of white evangelicals believe that Jesus is either definitely or probably coming back by the year 2050. Their conviction that the second coming is imminent provides these Christians with a powerful worldview and an explicit framework through which to understand their place in history as well as their trajectory of their nation and their world. It also affects how they live and act. The conviction that time is running out fosters among some Christians an absolute morality, a passion to right the world's wrongs, and a profound sense of urgency. They know there's no time for compromise, for mediation, or for negotiation. Judgment is coming, and God's will be done. They want to make sure that they're on the right side of history. Such beliefs have impacted the modern world, shaping everything from Americans' views of politics to education to popular culture to national defense. So today, what I'm going to focus on to play on these themes is three different individuals, three people we often don't think of in conjunction with one another. Those are David Koresh, Harold Camping, and Billy Graham. Each of these individuals, like millions of other Americans, drew inspiration from the Bible and treated it as a guide for understanding the future. Nevertheless, the futures that each of them saw was very different, as well as their own understanding of the role that they could play in bringing that future to be. While most Americans would very much want us to separate the violent prophecies of David Koresh, the date-setting urgency of Harold Camping, and the more mainstream evangelicalism of Billy Graham, the work of these prophets of apocalypse has much more in common than I think most men and women realize. Now, Christian apocalypticism has ebbed and flowed since the early church. It's something that's sort of come and gone in different moments of history. But there's two particular theological issues, and if you can just bear with me as I explain these, you'll understand why they actually make sense in a real historical context in a second. But there's two issues that are particularly important for understanding these three individuals. The first is their understanding or their view of the millennium. The book of Revelation talks about a 1,000-year millennium, a time of peace and prosperity at the end of time. All three of these individuals believe that Jesus is going to return before the millennium. So they identify as premillennialists, as opposed to other groups of Christians who believe that Jesus is going to come at the end of this 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. The second issue has to do with what's going to happen as we approach that millennium. And that is that most premillennialists believe that the world is going to go through a period of tribulation immediately before the return of Christ, which is then going to happen immediately before the establishment of the millennium. Now, for those who believe that we're going to face a tribulation near the end of time, there's also a debate as to whether or not Christians will endure this tribulation. They'll be part of it, they'll have to suffer through it, or whether or not Christians will be raptured out of the world, taken to heaven, and not have to go through the tribulation that is going to happen to everybody else who's left behind. Now, these issues, premillennial, postmillennial, pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, have divided Christians throughout history. So that's some of the theological background, and now let me talk about what this actually means in the everyday lives of these individuals. So first, David Koresh. Koresh was raised in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, a strong millenarian tradition in the United States. He eventually left the Seventh-day Adventists and joined the Branch Davidians. Davidians taught that in the last days, God would raise up an earthly leader, a model of King David, to establish an earthly kingdom of God. But before they established that kingdom of God, they taught that Christians would face horrific persecution, that they would go through this intense tribulation, and that would ultimately lead to the premillennial but post-tribulational return of Jesus Christ. And what they believed and what they preached was that Jesus' return would cleanse the earth of all impurities in a bloody, horrific apocalypse. So for the Branch Davidians, Koresh was a compelling leader who was very charismatic, and he was able to articulate their ideas and to give life to their theology in powerful and profound ways. And what he taught was that since the Branch Davidians would be the sole representatives of God on earth, as they were moving towards the last days, they would face off against the forces of evil during the tribulation period. So to prepare for this inevitable confrontation, Branch Davidians, as you all know, began stockpiling guns in their Texas compound. Koresh also warned that the Branch Davidians would face off against the forces of evil, and that the forces of evil would often take form through the government, through the federal government. Now, this was actually not that obscure of a belief. Many conservative Christians throughout the last couple hundred years believe that in the end days, part of what's going to fuel the tribulation is the rise of a political leader called the Antichrist. The way the Antichrist is going to assume power is through world governments. And so Koresh is just one of many, many leaders who would say that in the end times, in the last days, the government is going to be the enemy of the true church, the enemy of Christians. As you all know, the ATF raided the Branch Davidians compound on February 28th, 1993. There was a bloody confrontation and then a 53-day standoff. To the saints, to Koresh and his followers, this seemed to mark the beginning of the end. This was the start of the tribulation. This was exactly what Koresh had warned was going to happen. So in the U.S. government turning against the Branch Davidians, it was actually fulfilling prophecy. Now, the ATF and then the FBI had from the beginning refused to take Koresh's views seriously. Shortly after the immediate confrontation, David Koresh called the local sheriff, somebody he had a relationship with, and tried to explain to him that this was fulfilling Branch Davidian prophecy, that he could explain to the sheriff what was happening and hoping that the sheriff would intervene and protect the Davidians from the federal government. The sheriff refused to listen, just didn't want to hear what Koresh had to say. Koresh responded by telling him, "This is life and death. Theology is life and death." Now, we know from investigations after the fact that the FBI and the ATF just didn't understand, didn't take seriously Koresh's theological perspectives. And Congress was very clear on that. Congress reprimanded the leaders involved in the standoff for that very thing, for not taking theology seriously. The standoff ended with the deaths of more than 80 Davidians, including many children. So what are we to make of this? Koresh's apocalyptic ideas emerged from a very rich, very vibrant tradition. Like millions of Christians before him, he believed in the imminent second coming of Christ. Yet his understanding of a very small issue within this premillennial theology, the tribulation, is what distinguished him from most others. He saw in the Bible evidence that the faithful would live through the tribulation, that they would have to endure this horrific suffering period. And he believed that God wanted them to endure this tribulation, and that God had chosen them to be a small remnant of saints to testify to God's power and God's ability, and to physically battle the forces of the Antichrist. So when the ATF launched this raid against the Davidians' compound, this minor point of theology produced truly cataclysmic results. The U.S. government then naively and inadvertently played into Koresh's theology in very, very tragic ways. As Koresh explained, theology was indeed not just life, but death. So while one group of Christians anticipating the coming apocalypse, died in an awful inferno. Another faded into obscurity, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And that takes us to Harold Camping. On May 21st, 2011, thousands of Christians expected to be raptured to heaven. As they prepared to leave this world, the media was following this story very closely. Millions of Americans were watching on television. People were developing playlists about the end of the world. There were stories in newspapers and on the internet. And some of the most creative folks mocked them by inflating blow-up dolls with helium and releasing those dolls to the heavens. At the center of this rapture drama was this minister, Harold Camping, by that time an elderly radio preacher from Oakland, California. Camping had begun broadcasting on a radio network called Family Radio, or he developed this radio network, Family Radio, in the late 1950s, and it continued to grow and develop through the second half of the 20th century. So that by the early 2000s, Family Radio had 140 stations in the US, and they translated Camping's radio shows into many different languages, which they broadcast internationally via shortwave and also through the internet. Now, in 1992, Camping told his radio audience and his followers that he had discovered, after a lifetime of studying the King James Bible, that there were secret patterns embedded in it, and that through those patterns, he could determine when Jesus was going to return to the earth to rapture the saints to heaven. The math is complicated, but he essentially argued and believed that the world was about 13,000 years old, and he could actually trace Adam's creation back to a very specific year. He believed if you move forward from that creation of Adam 13,000 years, then the second coming would happen shortly after that. It would come 23 years after that 1300-year period, 1988. You don't need to follow this math. But what he argued was that it would probably happen in 1988, but that his numbers, he admitted from the beginning, might be off, and it could be in 2011 that Jesus would return. He also knew what month and what year Jesus would return. It would happen between September 15th and September 27th, but he could not tell us what hour or what day, because Jesus had said no man would know the hour or the day of his second coming. Just, you could know the month and the year. Yeah. Now, despite Camping's confidence in the second coming, he instructed followers not to plan for the rapture, not to give up their day jobs, but to live, quote, as if Christ's return is still 100 years away. And that's important. He really urged caution. Now, his understanding of the tribulation differed in significant ways from that of Koresh and from many other mainstream Christians. For Camping, the tribulation was not going to be marked by an armed conflict, as Koresh had taught, but instead by great religious apostasy and by immorality. And so for Camping, he believed that the tribulation was already upon us. It was already upon him and his followers. The signs were increasing numbers of divorce, women taking leadership roles in churches, increasing same-sex relations, and sexual promiscuity. So this is very different than the sense of tribulation that Koresh had. Obviously, the 1994 date proved wrong. Camping essentially disappeared from national news, but then reemerged again in 2010 on the basis of a book he'd written a few years earlier, again laying out his argument, his logic, his numbers, this time predicting that Christ would return on May 21st, 2011, and that judgment would occur shortly after that. Once again, he did not urge despair or drastic action, just radical evangelism. At Family Radio, he explained, we make decisions as if the end could be quite far away. We are the first ones to understand that we are not infallible in our conclusions. His followers, though, didn't quite hear his caveats. They took his ideas and ran wild with them. And so they began putting up billboards in cities all over the country, bus benches. They bought RVs and painted them with slogans, warning followers that Jesus was coming back in 2011. I encountered them in a New York subway in 2010. I also saw one of their billboards in rural northern Idaho in 2011. I mean, these folks got around, and many of you probably saw them as well. They were sure that Jesus was going to return. Of course, he did not. And unlike Koresh and the Branch Davidians, they slowly faded back into obscurity. Which then takes us to Billy Graham. Graham has been a strident apocalypticist from the very beginning of his career. His first major national revival, the one that put him on the map, was in 1949 in Los Angeles. This occurred just 2 days after Harry Truman announced that the Soviet Union had detonated an atomic bomb. And so the world recognized that there was a global apocalypse in the making, and Graham wanted to make the most of that, to urge people to make decisions for Christ, as well as to be serious about their commitments to Christianity. And this is a theme, then, that he played over and over again throughout his entire career. In most of his revivals, he would preach a message on the imminent second coming of Christ. He published a book in 1965 called World Aflame, laying out his argument for a second coming. In 1983, he published a book called Approaching Hoofbeats, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, again laying out this argument. In 1992, he published a book called Storm Warning, again explaining that the earth was in its last days. And then in 2010, he reissued the book Storm Warning, updating it for the modern context. In this book, he said, now at 91 years old, I believe the storm clouds are darker than they have ever been. Benevolent hands reach down from heaven to offer us this most hopeful warning and remedy. Prepare to meet your God. The signs of his imminent return have never been greater than they are now. And for Graham, he was very creative at explaining what those signs were. And so in the 60s, it was the counterculture, it was the free speech movement, it was love-ins. In the early 1990s, it was the AIDS crisis, it was the Gulf War, it was Saddam Hussein. In the post-9/11 context, he looks at the rise of what he calls Muslim extremism, the global economic recession, the influence of what he sees as godless popular culture, as well as the rise of multiculturalism. All of these are signs that we're living in the end times. So Graham's work illustrates how masterfully evangelical premillennialists have linked the major issues of every generation to the coming apocalypse. What is it that sets Graham apart from Koresh and Camping? First, his view of the church. Camping and Koresh both believed that the church was corrupt, and so they called people out of the church. Graham did just the opposite. He wanted to strengthen mainstream churches, evangelical, even Protestant liberal churches. He wanted believers to work together and to build bridges between different churches, which made him much less offensive or threatening to other religious leaders. Graham differed with Koresh on the Battle of Armageddon. Graham believed that there would be a Battle of Armageddon, but that Jesus would do the fighting, not Jesus' followers, so there was no need to stockpile weapons. And unlike Camping, Graham believed you could not know the date of Jesus' second coming. And so for Graham, the second coming was always imminent. If it's not right around this corner, it's around the next corner. And in some ways, that was the genius of his work, is to always keep expectations high. They also had very different perspectives on the state. While Koresh and Camping criticized the American government, Graham befriended politicians of both political parties. While Koresh became the target of the government, Graham counseled Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush, and in fact shared with them the apocalyptic rhetoric that they both ended up appropriating and adopting for their various policies. So in this way, Graham might have actually been more dangerous, depending on your own politics and theology, than Koresh in terms of his influence in the way in which his doomsaying has influenced American history. So to conclude, the work of these three prophets of doom give life to polling data that indicates that millions of Americans believe the time is nigh. Why Americans in particular are so obsessed with the apocalypse is not entirely clear. Nevertheless, the U.S. has produced creative and innovative religious leaders who have drawn on the deep tradition of Christian apocalypticism to get their message out. Sometimes, like David Koresh, their work threatens the nation. Sometimes, like Harold Camping, their work provides belittling amusement. And sometimes, like Billy Graham, their work can shape national and international politics and penetrate the White House. Regardless, the stories of all three reveal that apocalypticism has been essential for understanding recent American history. Thanks.
So this is the final presentation, the final panel, after a long day of really fascinating paper. So I will do my best to keep you with me. It's a tricky thing, I think, to write about the recent past, as I am doing in this paper, because time has a nasty way of not stopping, although apparently plenty of people believe it will stop at some point. And right now, there is much talk, of course, about the midterm elections and whether they were a wave or a slacking or just a typical 6-year loss that presidents tend to receive. But I want us to think back just 6 years ago, as President or as Barack Obama won and took office, when accounts of demise shared space with dreams of rebirth. And the prospect of a post-Christian right America, that phrase was in the air, was very much at the forefront of the hopes surrounding 2008. In the long history of American evangelicalism, in public life, to be sure, this development could be seen as a kind of reversion to the mean in terms of the Christian right being cast as a kind of exceptional thing. But gauged by the curve of American politics within Obama's adult lifetime, change seemed like a very appropriate word for what was going on in 2008 and thereabouts. This paper explores the significance of the Obama phenomenon, both Barack Obama's rise to power and his tenure in office, for the place of evangelicalism in recent American politics since the 2008 campaign. In a notable shift from the previous 40 years of American political culture, evangelical politics stopped functioning as a proxy for religious politics in general. Some evangelicals on the left learned to welcome this loss of status, while many on the right were very much determined and are very much determined to reverse it. Now, evangelical politics was not about to leave the public stage, of course, but the Obama era, I argue, did signal the decline of evangelicalism as a kind of privileged political force. The political fortunes of Barack Obama rose alongside those of a resurgent evangelical left. The broadly unpopular presidency of George W. Bush, at least around 2005-2006, very much presented an opportunity for each. It highlighted evangelical dissent from Bush, and it also highlighted Obama's proposed alternative. The junior senator from Illinois, to be sure, was hardly cut from evangelical central casting. Yet as a fresh voice with little political baggage at that time, Obama was in a position to say the kind of things that progressive evangelicals very much wanted to hear. And signs of a newly prominent evangelical progressivism were everywhere in 2006 and 2005, before that. From the opinion pages and the bestseller list of the New York Times to protests against Bush's address at the presumably friendly Calvin College in Michigan. Meanwhile, Jim Wallace of Sojourners became something of a national celebrity. And in the aftermath of Bush's narrow victory over John Kerry in 2004, there were a number of very much non-evangelical Democratic leaders like Howard Dean and Nancy Pelosi who reached out to evangelical progressives and moderates. In some ways, they actually echoed the moves that Bill Clinton had made a decade earlier. Those overtures, combined with Bush's growing unpopularity, gave progressive evangelicals a very rare political leverage at that moment. In many ways, Obama had anticipated the Democratic Party's new evangelical strategy. Obama entered the national stage with a memorable keynote address at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. And one of the most quoted lines from his speech featured a brief but unmistakable flourish of evangelical parlance. Obama said that we worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around our libraries in the red states. I mean, he was in many ways trying to blur the colors of the culture wars, of course, but many Americans certainly recognize that phrase, awesome God, as an allusion to the swaying chorus line of the popular praise and worship song, Our God is an Awesome God. One of the few political advantages that Obama's unorthodox religious background provided him was the chance to fashion his own story, really without much of a template. Obama was not the typical Democrat, the typical Democratic voice for faith in public life. In other words, he was not a white Southern moderate like Bill Clinton. He was not an African-American minister activist like Jesse Jackson, and he was not an urban Catholic like Mario Cuomo before him. In the world of presidential politics, there really were no precedents for a Hawaiian whose background, in many ways, was more Pacific than Atlantic and merged the Middle America with the post-colonial diaspora and the American racial binary. Yet Obama was able to craft an eloquent and appealing story about his spiritual and political coming of age. Spiritually, his tale was one of how a biracial product of a nominally Christian, if hardly observant, upbringing found identity, community, and meaning within the confines of Jeremiah Wright's largely African-American Trinity Church in Chicago. And politically, this was the story of how an instinctively secular community activist, inspired by the witness of the civil rights movement, came to see how faith offered something vital to the project of transforming neighborhoods. So Obama's spiritual and political awakenings in many ways went hand in hand in terms of how he presented himself. For an ambitious political figure or public figure, Obama was, I would say, uncommonly candid about his lack of orthodoxy. And I think here of a 2004 interview that he gave with the Chicago Sun-Times journalist named Catherine Fasani. In this interview, which received more attention, particularly on the political right, just after Obama took office, Obama was very much the voice of the candidate as Christian seeker. His multicultural upbringing gave him, quote, a suspicion of dogma, as well as a distaste for, quote, that language that implies I've got a monopoly on the truth, or that my faith is automatically transferable to others. By this, Obama meant not only criticizing shrill fundamentalism, but he was also departing from some established Christian doctrine. He said, I find it hard to believe that my God would consign 4/5 of the world to hell. The Obama faith story then momentarily aligned with the trajectory of evangelical politics. Clearly, Obama saw this convergence as critical to his presidential ambitions. And I think this is interesting because there's a bit of irony or something here, in that Obama, in my estimation at least, was in many ways the first successful presidential candidate since John Kennedy, perhaps, whose background gave him the option of operating wholly outside of an evangelical framework. Yet just as Kennedy famously felt obligated to assuage the fears of white Southern Protestants, Obama made a conscious decision to engage evangelicals. And a key moment came when he spoke at a 2006 gathering of Call to Renewal, a kind of activist network that was very much associated with the evangelical left and Sojourners. Obama framed his address as both a strategic proposition to secular progressives and a challenge to evangelical progressives to step up their game. Obama chided liberals, including himself, because, quote, if we don't reach out to evangelical Christians and other religious Americans and tell them what we stand for, then the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons and the Alan Keyses will continue to hold sway. Obama had defeated Alan Keyes in the 2004 Senate election. Still, Obama's conventional liberalism was on display in this address. He did not shy away from referring to his, quote, pro-choice position. Just as boldly, Obama asked the faithful to adjust to a more pluralistic America. He said that democracy demands that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religious-specific values. It requires that the proposals be subject to argument and amenable to reason. Jim Wallace of Sojourners likened the speech to Kennedy's olive branch to Southern Baptists back in 1960. Obama had achieved much more than a rapprochement, though. The Evangelicals phenomenon was born. That phrase, Evangelicals, actually was used a few times, and there's actually a book out by that title. The storyline of a new direction for evangelical politics was thus a critical part of the Obama campaign narrative, more important, arguably, than the actual tally of evangelical votes that the candidate received. Especially notable were those moderate evangelicals who came over to arguably the most left-leaning presidential nominee in a generation. And Obama made a point of reaching out to prominent evangelicals who were not customarily associated with the Christian right. Amid an overwhelming sentiment at the time that George W. Bush had damaged the evangelical brand, such gestures mattered. So a number of more erratic evangelical leaders like Richard Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals, or Orlando megachurch pastor Joel Hunter, or even Houston Methodist pastor Kirby John Caldwell, who was a confidant of President Bush. They came to support Obama the candidate, but not the urban liberal wing of the Democratic Party from which Obama hailed. A certain amount of opportunism, no doubt, factored into those relationships. Very few people who met Obama in this time period did not think that he was presidential material. But their support came with some serious risks. Obama actually reached out to Joel Hunter, the Orlando megachurch pastor, after Hunter had praised Obama's A More Perfect Union speech, which was delivered in response to the controversy surrounding past sermons by Jeremiah Wright. And that flap definitely threatened to do deep damage to Obama's religious image. So he made a point of not squandering the goodwill of his evangelical backers. Ron Sider, a kind of iconic member of the evangelical left, actually gushed that Obama understands evangelicals better than any Democrat since Jimmy Carter. The boldness of Obama's evangelical strategy, especially his rather unabashed attempt to drive a wedge through the evangelical center, or rather to drive a wedge through the evangelical center and the evangelical right, tempted contemporaries to exaggerate both the breadth and the depth of Obama's evangelical politics. While Obama made inroads among moderate evangelicals and Catholics, the so-called God gap endured among evangelical voters as a whole. Obama's substantive gains came elsewhere, especially among Latino voters, who were the main reason why Obama won a majority of the total Catholic vote. Yet the reaction of the Christian right's old and new guards to Obama suggested that they were on the defensive. So for every Rick Warren, who was willing, of course, to pray at Obama's first inaugural, there was at least one, or three or four, persons like Franklin Graham, who, once Obama's popularity dipped a bit in office, then wasted little time in going public with his doubts about the commander-in-chief's piety. Indeed, I think Franklin Graham's numerous comments along those lines pointed to a kind of paradox concerning the evolving public response to Obama's faith story. Obama's faith story was very widely publicized. Own writings, Time articles, Newsweek articles, etc. The chapter-form transparency of Obama's faith, as I call it, only made it the subject of wilder and wilder speculation. So it just simply was not taken at anything resembling face value by quite a few Americans. So in spite of Obama's triumph in 2008, the Beltway conventional wisdom still held that the most authentic grassroots political trends came from the right, not the left. And the rise of the Tea Party phenomenon seemed to prove this assumption true. Strangely, though, at least in my reading, the rise of the Tea Party did not really or fully alter the perception that the Christian right was tattered, or at least not its old self. And this is a diagnosis that to many the 2012 election then confirmed. And less noted in the run-up to 2012 and beyond was the evangelical left's return to a kind of marginal status. The midterm election cycle, that is the first one, 2010, saw a momentary return to the thesis of evangelicalism as a political nemesis for Democrats. To be sure, the Tea Party promised something new on the right, but as scholars David Campbell and Robert Putnam convincingly have shown, though, the overlap between the Tea Party and the Christian right was always significant, in spite of all the talk about the Tea Party's more libertarian proclivities. A case in point was talk show host Glenn Beck's giant Restoring Honor rally on the Capitol Mall in 2010. It was a revival-like gathering that suggested what an ecumenical Christian right politics might look like. Beck himself was a convert to Mormonism, and his rally featured an intentionally interfaith and multicultural mishmash of civil religion updated for the post-civil rights movement conservatism. Look forward, look west, look to the heavens, look to God, and make your choice, Beck told the crowd. He's really all over the place in a lot of ways. The rallying cry of religious liberty, which will gain more attention in the 2012, also was a kind of ecumenical glue. But in some ways, because the Tea Party was cast as such a novel and more libertarian-leaning phenomenon, the assumption that the Christian right was declining was largely unchallenged. At best, then, I think 2010 can be seen as a kind of halfway rebirth for the Christian right. The status of the evangelical left, which had been so important for at least how Obama presented himself in 2008, was even less certain. Echoing the history of its counterpart on the evangelical right, the evangelical left's profile had peaked with an election in 2008. Still, the evangelical left was not a mere media construct. Like other progressive activist evangelical leftists pushed Obama on economic matters, criticizing the president's willingness to compromise with the GOP on tax cuts, for example. With the conspicuous exception of abortion, and I think that is a conspicuous exception, though there were signs of a general convergence between progressive evangelicalism and mainstream liberalism. And this trend, I think, surfaced in a kind of surprising area, that of marriage. After Obama came out for gay marriage in 2012, several progressive evangelical bellwethers followed suit. That same year, a pastor an author named Brian McLaren, who's kind of a pioneering figure within the so-called emerging church scene, which is kind of seen as a reaction against the mega church GOP paradigm. McLaren further riled as many evangelical critics by presiding over a commitment ceremony involving his recently married son, and also mentioned in the New York Times. Meanwhile, Jim Wallace drew national attention for reversing his position on same-sex marriage. The same-sex marriage debate increasingly showed signs of resembling past arguments about the acceptability of segregation, more than ongoing conflicts about abortion. The historian Randall Balmer has also offered past debates about divorce as a possible analogy, too. At the very least, discussions of sexual orientation had entered new territory. After the 2012 election, the Obama inaugural committee once again tapped a minister with a history of opposition to gay rights to pray at the ceremony. The first one was Rick Warren. This time, though, Louis Giglio, whom Obama had praised for his work on human trafficking, quickly withdrew from the program. The 2012 election offered a new explanation for the decline of the Christian right, and that was demographic transition, something that's come up a number of times. So it was declining numbers rather than threats from the evangelical left that were what truly hindered evangelical conservatives. And there were several reports funded by the Pew Charitable Trust that highlighted the implausibility of the lingering assumption that evangelicalism was a kind of majority, silent, moral, or otherwise. And definitely the narrative of the rise of the nuns was a factor there. Still, it's interesting to me that in 2012, the GOP nominee, Mitt Romney, embraced a version of George W. Bush's successful 2004 strategy regarding evangelicals. The assumption was that the evangelical electorate was still very much a slumbering giant. And white evangelicals did turn out in great numbers for Romney, but Obama still won fairly comfortably. Now, as usual, the political wins were easier to detect than actual policy changes were to affect. And in this presentation, I'm definitely sliding the policy side. I touched on this a bit in the larger paper, and I suggest that Obama has proved to be a consistent social liberal who operates within the faith-based framework that he inherited from the Bush administration. For example, he kept Bush's faith-based office, as has been noted, and started a similar initiative in the State Department. In conclusion, nearly 4 decades after 1976, the year when George Gallup Jr. Pronounced the year of the evangelical and when Jimmy Carter won office, the perpetual relevance of evangelicalism no longer was taken for granted. Among the chattering classes, at least, all signs suddenly pointed to decline. Markers ranged from the sale of the iconic Crystal Cathedral megachurch in Southern California to the increasing number of Americans who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. On the political side, declared one Obama official, quote, "The understanding that the evangelical vote is a king-making vote, I think, is now dead." Few then dared, as had been the case in 2008, to imagine that the evangelical left would ever become the Democratic Party's version of the Christian right. The Obama presidency had promised a new twist on the old story of American faith and politics. In Obama's first inaugural address, as we've heard, he spoke of a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. And so religion, which had been so often defined, I argue, in evangelical terms, had a special place in the pantheon of American worldviews, but not an exclusive place. Yet, many of the issues that powered the evangelical right's rise and galvanized its discontents on the left have not run their course. The issue of abortion, especially, will stay salient. It might even become more so if Roe v. Wade does not survive. Many voters on the left and in the center still view Christian conservative activism as a threat to American democracy. These postures are now entering their second generation, and they're fairly easy to spot. Obama had offered to change the subject. Obama was better equipped, I argue, than any president before him to grasp American pluralism in all its fullness. But if Obama's story is America's story, though, then its next turn is no more certain than the latest election cycle or the next Supreme Court decision. Thank you.
The 114th Congress gavels in this Tuesday.